Cool. Right, yeah, let's dive in. Just briefly, those of you who don't know me, I thought I'd do a quick overview. So actually, I was billed as a Canon ambassador in the marketing blurb that CVP put up. I'm not actually a Canon ambassador at the moment, but I am. I do use their products. I run a couple of different businesses. So my main function is as a colorist, actually. But I run one business I run is called Coro Academy, which is a color training and film academy. We're a Blackmagic design training partner in the UK. So we offer Blackmagic's official course curriculum. And I also run Coro Films, which is a film production company. We do corporate film productions, again, in the UK. And it's through that where my sort of hands-on side of camera comes in. I've actually been operating camera longer than I've been doing anything else. But these days, I find myself 90% of the time in a color grading suite, but do pick up the camera quite often as well, because I cannot bear to be away from it too long. So I often shoot for our film production company if we're not bringing in DOPs. And I also run a new company, actually, which just launched back in February, which is called Just Grade It, which is a online color grading platform. I'm going to attempt to play a very short, it's only 60 seconds, color reel. I don't think you're going to get sound, which brings an interesting slant to this whole thing. Maybe you'll focus more on the images without the overbearing, punchy hip hop track. I don't know. But let's see how this works. This is just 6 seconds show reel. Okay, there we go. So that's my color reel. These are some of our clients. We work with Byron. All of these images were produced with our Canon equipment. We currently using C200 and EOS R. This is a summer campaign we did for Byron last year, and as is this, in fact. We've worked with X-Rite. We did X-Rite's commercial. In fact, funny enough, I'm using their X-Rite Color Checker Video XL, which this was the commercial we shot for that particular product last year, and it's been in my cupboard for a long time, the XL, and this happens to be the perfect time for me to use it because it's quite far away from the camera in my studio today. Anyway, so these are all shot with C200. This is all shot raw. In fact, this project, we'll talk a little bit more about Canon's raw light later on. And actually, this is a recent project which is as yet unreleased, which we'll be talking about, or I'll be talking more about in the coming weeks. But this is, again, all shot Canon C200, also raw. This whole project was raw. And there we go. So Canon Cinema EOS. Although I'm focusing on the C200, I think it's really worth pointing out that the range of Cinema EOS cameras, certainly at the moment with the recent introduction of the C500 Mark II, is quite a compelling lineup, from the C100 with its internally downsampled 4K to HD image up to the C700 full frame. They are a pretty formidable family of cameras. For me, the reason why I chose Canon's products, and running my own film production company, what it does help, as I'm sure a lot of you listening in who are self-employed or run your own companies are aware, it does focus your mind when it's your own money that you're putting behind equipment and a particular brand. And I've done my time with various different manufacturers, but keep coming back to Canon. One of the big things from a hardware point of view is I just love how robust their equipment is. In the past, I've worked at a couple of different universities where there's been an awful lot of equipment going out to students. And I always think that they are a really good environment to see how robust a manufacturer's products are, because God knows if something's going to get destroyed, it will be by a student. So it was always quite telling how a lot of the other manufacturers' cameras were often being repaired, but the Canon cameras, C100 particularly, is a very popular camera at a lot of film schools and universities, and they just went on and on and on. They got a hell of a battering. They are really built to last, these cameras. Another thing that I find very welcome is the consistent button layout. It really is very intuitive to move between the cameras, so it seems like a family of cameras that are designed to kind of make it easier for you as you progress through the range, as you find yourself working on bigger productions and using higher end cameras. It's nice that there's a familiar and consistent button layout as you move between the different cameras, and there's a kind of DNA running throughout the whole product hardware. Also, of course, a huge part of working with Canon is the EF ecosystem, whether that's cine lenses, cine primes, cine zooms, standard EF stills lenses. They are a hugely valuable part of the whole ecosystem, and also, of course, third-party lenses who have also adopted EF mounts. It basically, what it amounts to is just there being hundreds, if not thousands, of different options out there, and does make life very, very easy. Certain innovations come along once in a while and become sort of synonymous with a brand, and I think Canon can absolutely lay claim to completely revolutionizing the autofocus side when it comes to video. The touchscreen autofocus on the C200, C500 Mark II, and all of the other more recent Canon cinema cameras is quite remarkable. It does change the way that you work, and really opens up a huge amount of possibilities to the single operator, particularly the single camera operator. And yeah, I think that touchscreen autofocus is quite something. And it seems to be getting better and better. Well, as new firmware, new hardware comes out, it's just constantly being refined. The latest developments with the eye autofocus, just incredible. The other thing, and for me the biggest thing by quite some way, is the image quality and colors. I think this is kind of a double-edged sword when one refers to Canon and color science. As a colorist, it kind of irks me a little bit in a way to hear the word color science kind of bandied around. It's a bit of a meaningless term. And a lot of what I'm going to be doing today is kind of quantifying that for you and talking about why that reputation has built up with Canon. But for now, it just suffice to say that when it comes to image quality and color fidelity and color accuracy and reproducibility by any sensor and hardware grouping, I just think that the Canon Cinema EOS range are hands down the best, particularly at certain price points as well. It's really, really lovely to think, and as I say, in the past, having worked at universities, to think that people who are new entrants or early starting sort of in their career as filmmakers don't have that horrible sinking feeling where they're trying to learn their craft and getting back and looking at their rushes and wondering why skin looks wrong and skies look wrong, and it's one last thing to not have to worry about. It's a big weight off the mind of anyone that is concerned about color accuracy. So when it comes to the system, I think these are my top kind of 5. But I wanted to actually come out of this for now, and hopefully, if this works, this is a little bit Heath Robinson the way that I'm going to be doing this, but I'm hoping that you guys can all see. Yeah, I'm hoping that you can all see on my screen here a live feed coming from our C200, which is hooked up on a tripod here. So hopefully you can all see that. I wanted to kind of run through some of the considerations that you are going to find when you're working with any camera. So actually, quite a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is quite broad, and in fact apply to any camera system you might be working with. But in demonstrating this and talking about this, I think it becomes self-evident just how good the Canon system is. So let's start off. I've got my on-screen display actually going out to the feed, so hopefully you can actually see as I go through the menus. You can see the various different menu options as they appear. I'm not going to be. This isn't going to be one of those Vortex Media style drilling down into every single menu item. I just want to touch on some of the key components here that are going to be relevant to anyone who's shooting and using these cameras. So the menu system on the Cinema EOS range is again very consistent from camera to camera. It makes it very easy for you to find things if you're used to working with C300 Mark II and you want to come across and use C200 or C500 or whatever it might be, or C700. It's a nice consistent layout. And if we start, let's start off talking about our autofocus modes. Now my camera's actually not in autofocus at the moment, so I'm just going to turn that on. As I mentioned, the autofocus systems on the latest Canon Cinema EOS range are quite incredible, and there are various different ways that we can actually slightly augment it from an inanimate object, as we have here. I've just got this pointing at our color checker at the moment. From we're dealing with tracking of objects that are obviously stationary to dealing with people and faces. The most important aspects of the autofocus system are the fact that you can tweak the AF speed and AF response. It means that you can adjust how smoothly, for example, if you want to create a rack focus effect, if you're moving from one object to another, being able to adjust the autofocus speed and how it transitions through that is really useful. And I found myself, I shoot quite often handheld, and it's really nice actually to support the camera with, we use a top handle, and often support the weight of the camera on the other side with the EVF that ships with the camera, through which you can use the touchscreen autofocus, and actually reaching and moving. So I've actually even been in situations where I've manually focused on an object, and as you're moving with the camera, you're kind of combining manual focusing and touchscreen autofocusing at the same time. It's a very flexible system, which really does change the way that you work, but you've got complete control over the system through here. So for example, at the moment, I've got no person in the shot, but the face detection is rock steady. The face detection, in fact, is so reliable that it's got to the point now where, certainly when shooting interviews, that I just don't think about having to check or monitor the autofocus system. In fact, a good example of that would be last week we were filming for 3 days. In fact, we were filming solidly for 3 days a training course that will be going up on a platform called MZ. And I've done a couple of these training courses for MZ now, and the complexity of the amount of information we're delivering means that we're shooting for a long time. So like I said, we were shooting for 3 days last week, but we had a single camera operator. Now, partly this is because we were more or less locked down, so we were a little bit restricted to how much crew we could get involved. But we did have a single camera operator minding 3 cameras, all Canon, and mainly that was simply to make sure that they were cutting and rolling and keeping on top of the media management side of things. All cameras were set to face detection for the autofocus. And for 3 solid days, even with our A cam, which had an 85mm f1.4 prime on, which was at 1.4, there wasn't a single time where the autofocus system had to be overridden or interfered with, or switched over to manual, even when I was turning my face between the screen and back to the camera. So the face detection is quite incredible. When it comes to the different modes, there's a face priority and a face only mode. What's really useful about these is when in face priority, it will look for a face if there is one, but you can also manually tap. So you can see I'll be able to actually move the autofocus box around the screen, and essentially I can override that with the touch screen. There's also a face only mode, because if you're in face priority and let's say that someone is in the shot and then they're out of the shot, maybe it's a crowd, then it will then go looking for other faces, and if it can't find them, then it might end up drifting off to somewhere you don't want it. If you're doing an interview and someone turns their head fully and the autofocus system loses their features, if it's in face priority, you might find yourself in a situation where it will then go hunting for the next thing to focus on. It might be the back wall or something. Whereas in face only, that means that as someone turns, if it loses their face, it will lock the autofocus, the plane of the focus, to where it last had it. So if someone's face is coming and going, if they're turning their head, if they're moving back and forth too quickly, then face only mode will make sure that it doesn't drift off and try and hunt and find something else. We've also got, if we come in here, if we drive down to our autofocus speeds in here, so you can also see we can set our speeds. So if we're doing maybe B-roll and we want to tap on the screen and rack focus, we can choose to limit the speed and the responsiveness of it. In terms of the responsiveness for interviews, if you do have someone who is, moving forwards and back quite a lot, you can choose to drop the responsiveness down so that it's not constantly trying to hunt for that person. Or if you're shooting maybe some sports or something and you want it to be really actively responding as things are moving, and you can turn that up. There's a huge amount of flexibility in terms of the way that you work with this system. I think one of the mistakes that people sometimes make when they are first using these autofocus systems on the Canon cameras is they think that it's just a case of autofocus on or autofocus off. Actually, you've got to start to get your head around the idea that it's autofocus on with lots of different flexibility within that, depending on your subject and what it is that you're trying to capture, or autofocus off. So you can start to bear that in mind. And if we do turn this off, you'll see that the autofocus box changes to a slightly different on-screen display. What's interesting about this is a focus guide, and this focus guide is actually still using the same dual pixel autofocus data that's coming from the sensor that the autofocus system would be using. And what's powerful about that is it does two things. First of all, it shows you whether or not your focus is in front of or behind your subject. So if I bring that box over here, I can see that my focus is behind the subject, and I can close that down, and when it goes green, it's now in focus. If I come into the background here, it's now focused in front of that, so I know that I need to rotate the lens that way in order to pull the focus to the correct focal plane. But as well as showing you whether your focus is before or after your subject, it's used, because it's using the same dual pixel autofocus system, when it's green, it's dead on focused. And the reason I emphasize that is because a lot of people use peaking systems, and in fact there is a focus peaking system built into the camera as well. But these peaking systems are only responding to the pixels on the resulting image. And as such, it's very easy for them to show more area in focus than is actually in focus. So by using the focus off focus guides, you're essentially still benefiting from the technology that feeds into the autofocus system, and you're able to make far more precise focus pulls, which is increasingly important, obviously, as people working at higher resolutions. I find that focus peaking becomes less and less useful. And in fact, we've had a situation recently where a camera operator was operating a B cam, and they had focused, focus peaking they were using to aid their focus decisions looked very much like the whole of a control panel that we were using was in focus, but when you looked at it large on the full screen, it was quite crucially slightly out of focus in the area that we needed it. So it's one of those things that makes a big difference once you know it's there and how it works. Okay, let's get this back in here. Another important part of working with cameras, particularly cameras that shoot RAW, is black balance. So there is an option here, ABB, which is an auto black balance. Black balancing, if you've not done it before, is a process where the camera has all light cut from the sensor. So you put the body cap on, not the lens cap. It's quite important that it's the body cap of the camera, and you initiate an auto black balance where it will go through and it will read the sensor data from the sensor with no light on it, so that it can more easily discern where there are issues that need to be mapped out. It also helps refine the noise reduction inside the camera because it's monitoring the noise floor, again with no light being on there. And an analogy I typically use is when you're cleaning your computer screen. If you have your desktop picture up and various windows open, it can look like your screen is nice and clean, but when you turn power off to the screen and it goes black, particularly on these new glossy screens that we have on a lot of computers, it suddenly becomes blinding obvious where there are marks and where there are issues, and makes it easier for you to clean. And it's essentially the same thing with a black balance. By cutting out all of the light, it makes it easier for the camera to map out any issues and to refine its internal signal processing to make the best of the image. I would strongly suggest that an auto black balance is performed certainly every single time that there is a significant change to the operating temperature or of the environment that you're shooting in. Certainly if you've left camera equipment in a car or van outside for overnight or a few hours, and then you bring them inside and start shooting with them, that change in temperature can be enough to alter the results, because internal heat and heat management is a big cause of noise on all cameras. And so giving the camera the best opportunity to adjust to that operating temperature and map that out is a really good idea. In fact, if you're in any doubt, just do it before every single shoot, and you're always going to have a nice clean image. So, and as I say, particularly relevant to RAW, which we'll be touching on later on. Our custom picture and HDR section here, I'm going to be actually drilling through this an awful lot shortly, so I'll come back to this in more detail, but suffice to say for now that this is where we can come in and adjust our gamma and color matrix and start to tweak the look of the picture. And it's also where we can turn on our viewing LUTs and PQ and HLG modes. Our recording media setup, so initializing media, this is also where we can switch between recording in MP4, XF, AVC, or RAW. And you can see there that there are different media inputs on this particular camera. So we record to CFast 2 cards for the RAW in this. Actually, the newer C500 Mark II is using the much newer CF Express cards, which are much quicker. And in fact, the C500 Mark II, I think it still does. It certainly did when it first launched, ships with a 512 gigabytes CF Express card SanDisk card, which is really cool. So, which are very expensive cards, and it ships with them for free, which is really cool. But no such luck, actually, when I got the C200s. I had to buy my CFast 2 cards. Not that I'm bitter. So we have RAW internaling. So our RAW internal recording with the C200, if I come across to the next menu, you can see our options here. So we have 50 and 25, and you can actually see just underneath there the color sampling, our bit depth. So at 50p, we have 4K DCI resolution with a 10-bit depth. And if we switch into 25, that goes up to 12-bit. Fantastic having that internally in the camera. I think our corporate film productions that we work on are probably the sweet spot where this camera particularly is aimed at, whereas you will find more like the C300, more aimed for broadcast work and ENG work. The C500 Mark II, I think, is bridging that gap between sort of high-end commercial and starting even to kind of veer into features. I'm sure that someone soon, whether it's full-blown feature or certainly long-form content, will be using that camera, because it is essentially a C700 full frame in a smaller body. But you do open up, obviously, the external RAW recording with the codec systems into the C700 full frame, which is more kind of cinema level friendly. But I do find that the C200 for us particularly hits that sweet spot where we can flip between commercial work, as we were a few weeks ago, in fact, where we're shooting RAW, Tends to be lower volume, particularly in the studio, lower volume, lower quantity recording, so we can get away with increasing the quality of it. And it also gives us the maximum flexibility in post to really nail the look of the commercial, versus our more sort of everyday corporate work, where actually the MP4 is ideal. The MP4 gets, certainly in the past, had a bit of a bad rep. I think people have become slightly obsessed with numbers, and it's very easy to see MP4 8-bit 420 written down on a spec sheet and assume that it's useless. I was absolutely blown away when I saw the quality of the MP4 recordings from this camera. Yes, it's 8-bit. Yes, you're going to get banding in certain areas, certainly in skies and things like that. But to be honest, certainly with us, when we're delivering online, there's not a huge amount of people that are looking at that stuff on 10-bit monitors, using 10-bit deliverables anyway. So it's not a huge concern for us for our online deliverables. But because the camera internally actually has a fully 14-bit internal image processing pipeline, and it's only encoded into that signal, into that MP4 at the very last minute, you actually benefit from an incredibly high quality copy, essentially by the time that it's sampling that and compressing it. So it's always surprised me just how flexible that MP4 is and just how good it looks. I even did, up on my Vimeo channel, I think somewhere there's a RAW versus MP4 clip that I put up, which was a scene that I shot once in RAW and once in MP4, and then graded the RAW to match the MP4 so that the colors and contrasts were consistent between the two, and just labeled them as clip A and clip B. And over the it's been up a couple of years now, but over the years that I've done that, certainly in groups where you can play it nice and big on a big TV, I would say on average, people have definitely got that wrong. More often than not, they choose that the MP4 they think must be the RAW. It's at worst unidentifiable, and at best you could say that they look pretty much the same. So it's if you're one of these people that's been put off by 8-bit MP4 recording, I have to say they're very, very good quality. Moving through here, I think we'll get down into the nitty-gritty of the system, to be honest, and I'm going to not bore you to death with that stuff. So let's come back to here. So this is our custom picture section. I wanted to just talk to you briefly about exposure. I mean, I realize that this is kind of day one of film school or photography class to a certain extent, but it does bear repeating, I think, and it also is often surprising to me how often people don't necessarily know some of this stuff. So there's often talk of, in photography and video, in exposure triangles, in exposing using our standard principles of aperture, of shutter speed, and of sensitivity. But it's something that doesn't really hold too true in the real world. One of the things that I think you need to definitely get your head around, if you are used to thinking of exposure as being this kind of standard exposure triangle, is really starting to think about the impact on your digital imaging. Really, you should be starting to think about exposure as being a combination of iris or aperture, of shutter speed, but also then finally of light and your control of light. I think it's become too easy, particularly with the introduction of log gamma curves with these cameras, to forget some of the basic principles of just exposing an image correctly, and the importance of light, either cutting it using NDs or introducing it using obviously artificial light fixtures or natural light and bouncing it. And the idea of rating your camera at an optimum level and then lighting to that level is one that's absolutely standard practice in the high end of our industry, and one that I think too easily gets forgotten at the rest of the sort of lower end of the industry. So, for example, if we're lighting something, I have you can't see it here because I need a behind the scenes camera at the same time. That makes it easier. But if I just raise up, no, it's too dark. Well, anyway, I've got a Gemini 1x1 set up at the moment over there. And that is, if I turn that off, there you go, you can see the difference. I've just got that on low at the moment.
Ollie, you just had a screensaver turn up, so you know, to be wiggle your mouse.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Also, are we supposed to be seeing the menus currently as well? So it's just a clean feed out at the moment.
It was just turned off. Hang on, just 2 seconds. They were on most of the rest of the time, weren't they?
Yeah, I just noticed it now, so I'm not sure how.
Oh, good. Okay.
That's right.
Panicked me. Yeah, hang on 2 seconds. That's weird. They should still be on. Just give me 2 seconds. I must have accidentally. Oh, there it is. That's weird. It is still on. Okay. Let me just check what's going on. I think actually what's happened is. Oh yeah, it's just fallen asleep. I think with the. It is still on. It's just that the this software has. The Overexposed software has just fallen to sleep. Let's relaunch it. Yeah. No, it's not. How weird. Okay. So it must be the camera. Let's turn them off and on again. Turn them off and on again. No. Okay. In which case, no idea. How strange. What happened? Why did it suddenly turn off? Sorry, 2 seconds. See if we can get that working again. Would be useful if you could see as I move through the different gamma presets and see the effect it's having on the image. So. Let's restart that. Oh, I know what's done. Yeah, there we go. Sorry about that, everyone. Right. Okay. Hopefully we're back in action now.
Yeah, all good, mate. That's good.
Yeah, we're good. Cool.
Yeah, all good, mate.
So the basic principles of exposing your subject. So in this case, my subject is this chart. The basic idea of exposing, obviously, is juggling our aperture, our shutter. With aperture, with all of these things, actually, what we're trying to do is, and what I always encourage people to do, is to get to a situation where they are rating the camera in an ideal setup. So actually, you're almost pre-planning exactly how you want this camera image to appear. And then you're using things like lights and flags and bounce and whatever else you need to achieve what you're setting out to achieve, rather than pointing the camera and then adjusting things on it until it says it's exposed. So for example, with this image here, if I were to just expose it correctly, then we end up in a my brightness of this. There we go. There we go. So that's technically my subject exposed. But obviously you can see that has a huge knock-on effect to the rest of the image. There's a high dynamic range image. We have a large difference between the darkest parts and the lightest parts of the image. Very difficult to handle ideally, but it's one of these things where you have to kind of get used to the idea of managing a subject. So for example, if I expose for outside, there's no reason why I can't then use my artificial lights to bring up my subject. So here I've got my light now set at 100, and you can see I've managed to achieve. Unfortunately, I'm connected over HDMI, so the waveform monitor actually isn't coming out at the moment. It would have been over SDI, but I didn't have a long enough SDI cable. But you just have to take my word for it that the outside is just about, there we go, that's a bit better, just about exposed, and now our foreground is also exposed. And you know, I've increased my artificial light to account for that. I do think that that idea of lighting to an ideal. So in this case, what's the ideal? Well, I'm trying to think about depth of field potentially. You know, this is obviously all arbitrary, but let's pretend that I'm trying to concentrate on depth of field and achieving a certain level of depth of field to give separation to my subject from my background. You know, that's a creative decision. That's a creative intent that I have behind the image creation that is nothing to do with exposure. And by thinking of, you know, adding some stops of ND, therefore opening up the lens, you know, and this is a 2470 I've got here on the moment. If I had my 85mm f1.4, then I could achieve an even more separation with my background. But I'd have a situation where I'd have to manage the exposure even more because I could be opening up the iris even more. But moving away from sort of an almost, well, this is what I've been given, make do, to a how can I create the optimum image creatively? So thinking about depth of field, choosing an iris or an aperture that achieves the look that you're after with that depth of field, and then seeing, well, what does that do to my exposure? How can I manage that in terms of managing the light? In terms of shutter, or I've got mine labeled as shutter angle at the moment, you can see 180 degrees on the right side at the bottom there. So my camera is currently rated as a shutter angle at 50 frames per second, which is what I'm in at the moment. 180 degree shutter angle, so that should mean I'm at 100th of a second. Let me set my cameras to 25 frames. Here we go. You can see that the exposure has gone up because I've just changed this around. Oops. Let me drop this down. There we go, to compensate. So you can see by changing my shutters, my frame rate, sorry, that has given me a little bit of extra light because my shutter angle's at 180 degrees. Now I'm at 25 frames per second. My shutter will now have gone to a 50th. You can change this. If those of you who don't currently use shutter angles, it is incredibly useful. If I do go back to speed, obviously I can manually go in here and adjust my shutter speed. What's nice about being in shutter angle is 180 degree shutter angle will always be a normal amount of motion blur based on your frame rate, and the camera will automatically adjust that shutter speed, will automatically adjust that shutter speed as you adjust the frame rate. Whereas if I'm in shutter speed, I still have manual control over it, but then I have to manually remember. So for example, if I now go back in here and set this back to 50 frames per second, unlike before, you can see that the exposure hasn't changed. It's still at a 50th of a second. I'd have to remember to go in here and set that to 100 in order to maintain a normal amount of motion blur. Not that it really matters right now because the only thing moving is the leaves in the background there, but you get the idea. So shutter angle is quite a useful way of giving yourself just one less thing to have to worry about. And on the Canon cameras, that's in your camera setup menu. Just change it from speed to angle. You've also got in there your clear scan, by the way. Clear scan, very useful if you're getting flickering on electrical objects. That allows you to actually go through and set your shutter speed to small increments either side of the standard base frequency. So if you're at 50th of a second, you can actually slightly deviate from that to try and remove any flickering that might be happening on screen. So a couple of different options in there. I'm going to leave mine set to angle, and I'm going to go back to our correct exposure. When it comes to shutter, you can use it creatively. You might be trying to deliberately invoke some kind of feeling of maybe your main character being sort of intoxicated or maybe just coming round from an operation or something. You might creatively use slow shutter for that purpose. You might creatively use a high shutter speed to create some kind of sort of strobic, vivid impression in a way that potentially has been used in features. I always think of things like Saving Private Ryan and the high shutter speeds that gives that kind of vivid strobing to the sand on the beaches at the beginning. There are creative uses for shutter speed, although less need and opportunity to use that than potentially other things. But again, putting that creative decision first and then thinking about how that impacts your exposure and then adjusting for that later on. And then thirdly, instead of thinking of our, as I say, traditionally thinking of ISO as our sensitivity as our third mechanism for controlling exposure, starting to really quickly get away from that idea and instead starting to think of your camera's sensitivity and rating your ISO of your camera based on how you want to manage the dynamic range of your scene and how you want to manage the noise floor of the scene. So, for example, and this is specific to the C200, it does vary from sensor to sensor, but with the C200, I achieve the maximum amount of dynamic range that this camera sensor can achieve at ISO 800. So if I have a high dynamic range scene, and without my artificial lights on, you can see this is a very high dynamic range scene. I've essentially lowered the dynamic range by introducing this light, but it is a high dynamic range scene. It makes sense for me to rate the camera at 800 or above, because that's where it's going to get all of the stops of dynamic range that it can achieve when given a certain gamma curve. But that's not to suggest that there isn't the opportunity to change that. So as I move down to ISO 400 or even 200, I'm moving down and I'm sacrificing some of the dynamic range capability of the camera, but I'm also subtly shifting what dynamic range there is down. So I'm actually introducing cleaner shadows and introducing a bit more detail in shadow areas as I rate that down. And I'm also approaching the base sensitivity of the camera. So the base sensitivity of the C200 is in fact ISO 200, which even people who own the C200 don't necessarily realize. The 800 figure is where you get maximum dynamic range, but ISO 200 is the native sensitivity of the camera. So you're going to sacrifice some of that dynamic range, but that's not to say you're not going to end up with a cleaner image, potentially. So the idea of how much gain is going through the sensor, and therefore where zero gain is going through, and you're going to get the cleanest look, versus where the optimum amount of gain is going through to give you the maximum dynamic range from the sensor. Those are two very different things which we need to bear in mind. If you are unsure what the native sensitivity of your camera is, a very easy way to identify it is, if I go into my menu here, I'm going to switch my ISO gain. I can see it as either ISO or switch this to gain. And you can actually see straight away that has now become 12 dB. All I've done is change the label. So it was showing me as ISO 800. That equals 12 decibels of gain, which is an amplification of the signal. And an amplification of the signal gives you certain pluses and minuses. So at this level of amplification, we get the maximum dynamic range out of the sensor. But that's not to say that if I take away all amplification, so in other words, if I rate it at 0 dB, that I'm not going to have a technically cleaner image. If I have a scene that doesn't require a high amount of control and a high amount of dynamic range, so if I'm pointing my camera at something that's a standard, 10 stops, kind of Rec 709 range of dynamic range, I'm still going to get a better and cleaner looking image if I rate it at 0 dB than if I rate it at 800. Now, this doesn't apply to RAW, because obviously with the RAW, we are dealing with that as a separate metadata stream that comes through after the fact. But certainly in MP4, where there's more emphasis on you getting the best looking image you can, because obviously that's being encoded in camera, it's important to understand those differences. If I flick back into my menu, I'm going to go back into ISO. You can see I was at 0 dB gain. If I flick back into ISO, you can see it now says ISO 200. There's no reason why you can't apply that technique to any camera that you might have as a mechanism for finding out what the base sensitivity of the camera is, because it, as you can see, it's pretty straightforward. You set it at 0 dB, flick back, and whatever you then see is your base. So ISO 200 is the base sensitivity for the C200. But when we have a high dynamic range scene, which I do here, 800 or above is going to actually give me the better dynamic range. Not necessarily the better image, but better dynamic range, which is what I need right now. Okay, so in terms of exposure then, if we're kind of rating our camera in terms of ISO based on noise floor and optimizing the dynamic range, if we're setting the iris or aperture based on the creative decisions behind the image separation through foreground and subject in terms of shallow or deep depth of field. And if we're using our shutter either for faithful representation of movement on screen, or creatively, trying to create that kind of swirly effect with the low shutter speeds, or that intense sort of strobing effect of the high shutter speeds. If all of those decisions are being based creatively over the intention behind what you're shooting, rather than thinking, I must expose this image, it's a really good place to start, because it then kind of slightly forces your hand. I'm just going to take a sip of water, just 2 seconds. It slightly forces your hand to start thinking about what can you achieve, because without introducing extra light, if I switch off my light, you can see I actually can't get my subject exposed at all with this. With my other lens on, in fact, I'll go and grab it. Let me grab my 85mm. Switch these over. Come back here. Here we go. Because I can brighten this up, I should point out I'm in a color grading suite, so it's basically pitch black in here without the lights on. There we go. Let's just put a little bit on there. So there you go. That's technically exposed there. The reason I know that's technically exposed is because the white box at the top there on that color checker, you can see there's a large white section in the middle there. That's a 90% reflectance chip, and I'm currently in Rec 709, so that 90% reflectance chip should be hitting 90 IRE, and I can see on my waveform monitor that it is, so I can tell that that's exposed. But you can see, what that's done to outside. No, not a particularly lovely image outside. So when it comes to trying to balance this dynamic range, we can sort of light to our creative decisions, and then use this light, this third element to our exposure process, to make sure that we're getting what we want. We're essentially demanding that we have everything that we want. We have the depth of field we want, we have the motion blur that we want, we have the sensitivity range of the sensor that we want, and we have our subject exposed. And you can be selfish, don't worry. You can selfishly demand that you have all of those things in place with your image, and you should be demanding that you have all of those things in your image, because if you do, and you're not compromising when you don't have to, then you're just going to constantly be working from the best looking and best sort of starting point when you get back to whether it's color grading or editing or handing off those rushes to someone else. So the next thing that kind of this raises then is, well, how does this feed in with Gamut? So obviously, in an ideal world here, you'd have what I have, and you've got a light that you can introduce to balance that out. But let's pretend that we don't have that, and what are the compromises that we're making when we do that? If I come into my menu here, and I'm going to go into my custom picture mode, there are a variety of presets in here. Now, I don't tend to use the presets, because I have them set off, because what that allows me to do is then independently drill down into my gamma and color matrix. If I choose the BT709, you can see that these get disabled. So personally, I have my presets switched off, and then that allows me to independently come in here. And you can see I'm currently set to normal. So this is a standard BT709 Gamut and Gamma that's being applied to the image right now. So what you like about Rec 709 has become something that's been slightly kind of demonized, certainly by people who are sort of newly into the industry and haven't been around a bit longer. Rec 709 is not the devil. It is just a gamma curve, or BT1886s, and it is a very good gamma. It's a very good image. It's designed so that something looks pretty much accurate straight out the camera, and can go straight to delivery with very little manipulation of the signal after it's been captured. Of course, the big thing that it doesn't do is it doesn't respond well to those extreme highlights or large dynamic range scenes. And we have cameras that can now handle more dynamic range. So it does seem like the decision to always shoot log becomes an obvious one, but I can promise you, unless you're working on a certain upper tier of camera, I can promise you that you're going to get sometimes better results shooting in Rec 709 than shooting in log. So if you are sat there now thinking, or have heard, always shoot log, always work with a log gamma, I can assure you that that is not always going to give you the better image. It certainly will in a situation where there's a large dynamic range in your scene. But I've seen people who have shot, in fact, I had one relatively recently, an interview that had been shot in a very moody black background. Guy had a black suit on. I think the lightest, brightest thing in the whole image was his white shirt. And it looked great. It was a really nicely lit interview, and it was shot really nicely. Two-camera interview. Both cameras were rated. Both cameras were set to a log gamma, and in fact, it was they weren't Canon cameras. They were something. Well, I won't say what they were, but anyway, they were a different manufacturer's cameras, and quite a popular A/B mix of a main camera and a mirrorless B cam. And both of them were in a log curve, and the image was just so soft, so noisy, wasn't optimized at all for the scene that was in front of it. And I think that's really what you need to be thinking of. You need to be thinking about what's in front of my camera, what's the scene that I
Ollie,
have.
you've got screen.
What dynamic range do I have?
Ollie, you've got screensaver again.
How many stops of dynamic range do I have in my scene? And then therefore, how should I be approaching that? So if you have a scene that's below 10 stops of dynamic range, it doesn't really make a huge amount of sense to shoot that log. And it's also, and please take this from a colorist's point of view, doesn't stand to reason that you're going to give your colorist a better image to work from, or they will have more color information to work from if you are giving them something that's underexposed or a darkly lit, low dynamic range scene that's been shot log. It doesn't help us one bit, because it just gives us extra work in terms of adding in clarity and sharpness where the image has gone soft, or potentially adding in noise reduction tools. It really doesn't help us at all. So first of all, let's separate the idea of log being good for everything, and let's get back to a point where we're thinking about what's in front of the camera and what's the scene sort of demand from us. This scene right now, quite clearly, demands that I should be using a log curve, because we have a scene that has a large dynamic range in it. Let me just turn the camera over here. We've got my light stands over here. There we go. Beautiful. So this, you can see, actually, funny enough, the specular highlights on the reflections of those stands are actually pretty much perfect. You can see here, this is a dimly lit scene. Let me turn this around a bit. Bring up, there we go. A dimly lit scene that is very much less than 10 stops. I mean, actually, it's slightly difficult. This has got some specular highlights, so let's pretend those aren't there. But we have a scene here which, works quite happily in a Rec 709 environment. There's nothing wrong with this. And if I received this and had to color grade this, I'd be thrilled, because it's already ready to go. It's a well lit and well exposed image. But as soon as we point the camera, and I'm not even moving the camera, I'm just panning it around and tilting down to our other scene here. As soon as we move to a different shot that has a different dynamic range, clearly the issues are introduced. Now, you can imagine me using a log curve, and I will be using a log curve for this scene, but just 20 degrees to the left, and we have a completely different scene, completely different requirement in terms of how it's recording its spread of luminance. And to record both of those in the same gamma curve would be, well, to my mind, would be ludicrous, because we're going to end up with a very compromised image in terms of those light stands. Let's go down into my menus then, and let's have a look at what we can do here. The first thing to bear in mind is, and one of the most common questions that I get asked is, well, how do we expose for log? There's a couple of different approaches here, and I know which one I use, but I also know which one is probably easier to achieve if you don't have quite such a good memory as I do. You can either memorize all of the different references for where a 90% reflectance reference drops to if in a given gamma curve. And this entails going to a manufacturer's website and looking for one of their white papers about a specific gamma. So it could be C-log, it could be S-log2, it could be anything really. In fact, I did this last year. I was doing some training for the guys from DJI, and they were asking me about their D-log gamma curve. And I said, well, I don't know, I've not worked with it. Don't you guys know? And they're like, well, no, we don't, we're not sure. So we all as a group went onto their own website, found the white paper for D-log. And you will always find listed in those white papers, normally two references, a 90% reflectance and an 18% reflectance. 18% reflectance being a middle gray. And they will give you two values, the value of that reference in a Rec 709 curve, and then where it goes when you flick over to a log gamma. So for for example, S-log2, that 90% reflectance would drop to 59%. For S-log3, it would drop to 61%. There are varying different values depending on the gamma curve. They're all slightly different. Now you can memorize those and then simply lower your exposure or adjust your exposure once you're in that gamma curve and hit that value, which is obviously much easier when you have a chart. Or, and this is the absolute cheat way of doing it, and it works really well, is just remember one number. So when you're in Rec 709, we know that a 90% reflectance reference, which this top white box here is, a 90% reflectance reference will hit 90 IRE. And I'm afraid you can't see my waveform monitors, but my waveform is showing me that white box over here is at exactly 90 IRE. So I know that this, at least for my subject and where the chart is, I know that this is exposed correctly. If I then go into my menu and change my gamma curve, and it could be to any of these, I'm actually going to be looking at these 4 different gamma curves here. But let's go to Canon log, for example. I don't now have a non-properly exposed image. The exposure isn't now wrong. It can't be, because a gamma change is an arbitrary change. Well, not an arbitrary, but it's a change that happens further down the image processing pipeline. So I've adjusted my iris, my shutter, the amount of light in my environment. I've managed to expose that 90% reflectance chip at 90 IRE whilst I was in Rec 709. The fact I'm now in C-log doesn't mean that that exposure is wrong. The exposure is still correct. So in other words, if you want to know how to expose in log, one of the easiest and simplest ways, if you possibly have the chance, is to get a 90% reflectance chart, or if you don't have a chart, you can use anything that's bright white, like a white piece of paper will be roughly 90 IRE. Expose that correctly, and then change your gamma curve. It's still correct. The fact I've changed my gamma curve afterwards doesn't make any difference whatsoever. I can see now on my waveform monitor that 90% reflectance is now hitting 60 IRE, which I know is the correct value for a properly exposed C-log image. That information available from Canon in their own white paper about C-log. So if it's exposed before I change the gamma curve, it's still exposed now. If I go into Canon log 3, it will drop further. This is now bringing down that 90% reflectance value even further and helping bring in even more highlight information actually in the background there. Again, still technically exposed correctly. If I didn't know that, then I would go, and quite often this is what happens, you go into the log mode and then start questioning, well, then how do I expose this log mode? And one of the things that you'll find, and you may be thinking it now, is when you look at a log image from scratch with no kind of reference for how you got there, it's very tempting to look at it and go, oh, that looks dark. Very, very tempting to think it looks dark. And you might start thinking, okay, we need to increase the brightness here. Let's brighten this up. Particularly, I find it confusing where people have heard about exposed to the right as a methodology for exposing, which is perfectly valid. Exposed to the right, if you haven't heard of it, is the idea of deliberately overexposing slightly to bring in extra detail in shadow areas. There are camera manufacturers who specifically recommend that you overexpose by quite some way for certain cameras of theirs because it clears up noise in the darkest parts of the image. And if you're going straight into your log mode and you're not aware or don't know any better, it's very tempting to do what I've done here and sort of brighten up the image. If you're shooting RAW, that's absolutely fine. Because if you're shooting RAW, you are only actually ever recording and capturing those raw data values anyway. And everything that we're doing here in terms of the gamma is irrelevant because it can be changed after that. In terms of a compressed codec, though, it's really, really relevant. A classic example, and I see this so often, and it's very, very hard and very tricky to deal with from a coloring point of view, is where people have overexposed log with faces. If you look at a log curve, the most compressed part of that log curve is up in the highlights. As you go up into the highlights, you get less and less distance between shades of luminance, and therefore it's more and more gray and less contrasty the further up that curve you go. Faces exist in that middle gray area of the gamma curve. So if you overexpose the image, and actually this, I'll just point to it, this is our 18% reflectance, so this is our middle gray reference here. When I'm overexposing the image, I'm overexposing that too. In other words, I'm overexposing all faces, and I'm not just simply making them brighter, I'm pushing them up the gamma curve. I'm pushing them up into the more compressed, flatter, grayer part of the gamma curve. And so you have to be very, very careful about this idea of overexposing an image whilst in log, because if you end up pushing faces into the more compressed and flatter part of the gamma curve, when you then come back and transform that back, you end up with this very stubborn, it's quite difficult to get rid of. It requires quite a lot of finicky work with the curve. You end up with faces looking like they're completely flat, like they're made of plastic. It's this kind of mannequin look that you often see where people have overexposed faces in a log curve. First and foremost, to my mind, well, the better thing to do then is obviously get that right, but also is to choose a camera system that doesn't demand that you need to overexpose in the first place. We use the EOS R quite a bit as a B camera. And interestingly, we shoot the launch of the iPhone for Apple, and we have done for about 4 or 5 years now. And we do a similar thing each year. And we always start off the filming by filming the keynote, which is being streamed into the offices, into this big office in Apple's headquarters in London. And because we film there every single year, it's been interesting kind of baseline comparison as we've adjusted and swapped out equipment over the years. And this last year, it's the first time I'd done that with the EOS R. And it's basically a big office with about 100 people in it watching a screen, and the lights are off. So the only light that you have in that environment is the light from the TV screens. And it's always been noisy. I've always had to put noise reduction on it in the past, but this is the first time I'd filmed that scene with the EOS R. And because the image processing and the sensor is so clean, even though there were a few bright spots that I had to keep down and keep control, so I didn't end up filming that in C-Log, and it's so clean. There's very little light there, but the shadows are really, really clean. So by investing in a camera system that gives me, a nice clean image and doesn't require me to overexpose or to try and clean up noise, it means that you get to a situation where actually you don't find yourself having to compromise the image. You don't end up with faces in the wrong part of the gamma curve. So here we've got a perfectly exposed image that I can be confident about how I've exposed it, because I'm doing it essentially by the numbers. It's where it should be. So let me come back to, there's my exposed image there. Let's come back to these gammas. So I'm going to come back to my Rec 709, and the sun's come outside a bit. So let's just drop this down. There we go. So there's my Rec 709. That's my subject exposed. Let's look at how we can control these areas. Let me try and indicate them with my mouse. So hope you can see all this area here outside. It's actually, it looks like it's direct sunshine. It's not. It's quite overcast here today. It shows you even with a little bit of cloud cover, the huge discrepancy between these two areas. So this is exposed. This is hitting 90 IRE. This is gone over here. If I control that with my gammas, so let's go into the menu. I'm going to move up to, first of all, wide DR. Now, hopefully you can just about see behind the image. If you just look up in this area here, as I move that up into wide DR, you can immediately see it bringing down those areas of extreme highlight. Now, what you won't see, so I'm actually going to turn my on-screen display off so you can concentrate on the image a bit better. So let's turn this off. There we go. So you're just being fed the clean feed there. If I go back, and I'm just going to move back and forth between my normal and my wide DR. Now, if you look very carefully, obviously the highlights are an obvious difference. You see that we've brought back quite a lot of detail there. But if you look in these darkest areas, look over here, look at these flesh tone references here, look at the black chip down the bottom there, you won't see anything changing there. Now, that shows you exactly what wide DR is. It is a gamma curve that is the same as the BT1886 Rec 709 gamma curve. It's identical up until middle grey. And then once you get past middle grey, it then starts pulling down extra detail. So it's a change to the way it handles the highlights. One of the big things that means is the traditional sort of dog leg that you get with the Rec 709 gamma, which gives you that very horrible roll off into the highlights. That immediately is negated because you have this much smoother control over highlights and the way that it transitions and maps that luminance as it's going up through that curve. But it keeps everything below that point the same. And as you can probably imagine, in a world where we've got increasingly sensitive and cameras that can capture a wide dynamic range, but also a world where we're predominantly still looking at stuff on Rec 709 screens and devices, wide DR is a really useful curve because it can be a zero color grade curve. You don't have to grade the images that you shoot with it because they should map, particularly middle grade down and where your subject is, exactly the same as Rec 709. But if you're shooting scenes with a wider dynamic range, it faithfully and far more aesthetically pleasingly handles those highlights. So wide DR is not a log curve at all. It's a Rec 709 based curve that gives a much nicer, friendlier approach to the highlights as you move between them. As soon as we go up to the next stage, we move into Canon log, and then you can see there is a big difference between the way that the shadows are being mapped and the highlights. So we're pulling down yet more information in our highlights, and we're also elevating our shadows, and we're reducing the overall dynamic range between the black and the white point in the image. That's pulling down. If I look, I'll come out of here, go back to my waveform. We're still clipping some details there, but now if I move to Canon log 3, you can see we'll bring back even more. Now again, pay close attention to the shadow areas here as I move between Canon log and Canon log 3. Again, you shouldn't, just like wide DR is to Rec 709, Canon log is to Canon log 3. They are the same as each other up until middle grey. So log and log 3 are the same. It's only that in log 3, you have more data being captured at the top end. You have the highlights being brought down more. And what you can't see in here, and I don't have the option to select it in camera, I only have the option to do it once I've recorded raw, is Canon log 2. Canon log 2 is exactly the same as Canon log 3, but it brings back an extra stop in the shadows. So if you want to capture the maximum dynamic range of the camera, of a Canon camera, then Canon log 2 will give you the maximum dynamic range. It will give you all of the stops that are usable in the shadows and the highlight. It's not available to me in camera with the C200 because it's the Canon have deemed that there's not enough image data in the MP4 encoded internal compressed codec to actually get any useful data out of the shadows. So it's only when you're shooting raw that you then have the access with the raw footage to choose C-Log2. And some people would see that as a negative. I see that as an absolute positive. It demonstrates how Canon won't allow you to shoot yourself in the foot, basically. They know what their cameras can and can't achieve, and they're thinking about the quality of the data stream, of the data that they're getting from the camera, both in terms of internally compressed, but also then the raw footage it can generate. And they're intelligently thinking, well, look, what can we do with this signal? And they're not giving people the ability to try and pull out details in a signal that they know isn't going to have good enough quality information there. So quite a different approach to certain other camera manufacturers, where I do think they sometimes stick features in just so they can say that they have, and don't think too much about the impact that that has. And you know, sod it, I'll just come out and say it. I do think that the A7S Mark II has really no right having S-Log3 in it, given the quality of the codec and given the quality of the shadows on that particular camera. Fantastic camera, don't get me wrong, but a really good and quite stark example of where one camera manufacturer is sort of not allowing you to put yourself in a position where you've got a degraded image, and another one where camera manufacturer is basically saying, yeah, go ahead and use this. And I do know huge numbers of people that use the A7S II, recording internally in S-Log3, overexposing it and ending up with plasticky looking skin, very tricky to deal with, very noisy shadows, and ultimately compressed into an 8-bit compressed format that's using a curve that really is designed for a much higher quality codec. So do make sure you get that combination right of what gammas you're choosing and actually what strength of signal that you're producing, because you do need a pretty robust and data-rich signal in order to work with these more extreme gamma curves, that things like the Canon Log 2, the S-Log 3. So clearly Canon Log 3 is the one that we need here. I can see now, actually the sunlight's just dipped ever so slightly outside, so I've very comfortably got that in. I could probably even, yeah, so that's still in, that's in Canon Log. So we've got our scene managed, but don't forget what I said. There's nothing necessarily wrong with actually thinking about bringing in some extra light, and you know, nothing wrong with me actually doing that. That's Rec 709. That's not log at all. And that's just me protecting my highlights with the latitude that I've got and introducing light to actually illuminate my subject, to actually put the light where I need it. Okay, where did I put my phone? Oh, there we go. So the next thing that we want to look at then is color and our color options. The color matrix in the Canons is fantastic. There's a couple of different variations. So when color matrix is set to off, essentially what we have there is just using the standard Rec 709 chromaticity coordinates and plotting that in a normal Rec 709 gamut. But there are a couple of slightly augmented color matrices here. And what they enable you to do is to reproduce the kind of color look to match with other cameras. So there's a standard video mode. There's a Cinema EOS original, which matches really well with the like the 5D Mark II, for example. It's the color matrix that was in a lot of the DSLRs that Canon make. There's production camera. That's a color matrix that's designed to play well and mimic the color look of ARRI Alexa if you're mixing it in a production environment with Alexas. But this is the most important one to my mind, which is the most recent Canon color matrix, which is this neutral mode. First of all, it's a very faithful, very rich color information. The color matrix just works for almost all subjects. But the most important aspect of the neutral color matrix is the fact that Canon have used this as a basis to tie all of their current crop of Cinema EOS and now also their mirrorless range of cameras together. What that means is that if I record in the neutral color matrix on this C200 and then record in, let's say, an EOS R in the same neutral color matrix, assuming that you're exposing and white balancing correctly with those cameras, you should find that in terms of colors, that they are faithfully recording and plotting the colors of your subject in exactly the same way. Now, this is a big deal. This means that you can, for example, do what we do and record as an A cam with one of the full Cinema EOS cameras, and then use one of the mirrorless cameras, in our case, the EOS R, as a B camera, and cut between those angles of your subject, knowing that colors are going to be faithful and they're going to be accurate and they're going to look the same as you cut between those cameras. That's a really big deal to my mind, because there are actually very few other camera manufacturers that are really thinking too much about how they can guarantee that different products in their range, particularly moving between Cinema EOS and then mirrorless, and making sure that there's a consistency there. And this ticks all the right boxes for me as a colorist. I love consistency. I love the idea that I don't have to work and work and work on an image to make sure that as I cut between these cameras, they are faithfully matching each other. And camera matching in mixed multi-camera shoots is a huge deal. So this color matrix neutral is a huge benefit. It really is a massive time saver.
Just so you're aware, Ollie, the on-screen display is gone again.
I just noticed that.
Cool.
Yeah. Hang on. Back into here. Two seconds. Back on. There we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, so there it is. I was just talking about these ones. So the color matrix, Cinema EOS original production camera, and then there's that neutral one. As I said, this is the big one. This is the one that makes a huge difference, I think. And again, just great to be working with a family of cameras and a manufacturer that's thinking about making our lives easier. So in terms of the way that these gammas and color matrices are working, they're I think very predictable. You can expose by the numbers. You can think about your image in a quite clinical sense. You don't have to worry about factoring in problems with the sensor that are going to have to be compensated with changes to your exposure. A very nice, clean image all the time. The color matrix, very great. The neutral mixing perfectly with the other Cinema EOS range, and even now they're mirrorless cameras. And the other thing to bear in mind is this. I said this at the beginning. This idea of this Canon color science, what that actually means. If you don't have one, I would advise you to get a chart, because at the very least they are a fantastic way of checking out how your camera's recording key color data and plotting it. And I work with charts all the time, and what's really useful is you start to build up almost a kind of a mental library of differences between different types of camera and different types of sensor. So these, I'll just go and point to them on the chart. These chroma references here, these are your primary and secondary chromaticity coordinates, which relate to Rec. 709. Those of you that might have the Color Checker Classic, just bear in mind that the RGB and CMY references on that, they are not based on Rec. 709. They're not video standard. The Color Checker Classic is for photography, so they're not the same color values, so this doesn't necessarily apply to that. But the Color Checker Video, those chromaticity coordinates plot exactly on a vector scope according to Rec. 709. So if I come, let's see if I can switch over, and let's look at, actually just go back to, well actually no, I've actually got, give me 2 seconds, I'm just going to come and I think we've got some here. Yeah, here we go. These are quite old, but here we go. So this is what I'm talking about right now. So these, sorry, good. Hang on, 2 secs. Let's open these up. So these are actually quite old, but these are vector scope traces for the C200. These are the types of tests that I do with new cameras. So when you properly white balance, so full manual white balance rather than just guessing the Kelvin, off a color chart, and in a high quality light source as well. So ideally these are done under tungsten light conditions, or if you've got a a small shoot window in a cloudless sky outside, that's probably also going to work as well. But to take a snippet, just a few seconds recording of the color chart, so capturing these color references here, and then just opening it up on a vector scope. These boxes here represent where the chromaticity coordinates should be, and you can look at where your camera is plotting those signals on a vector scope, and you can build up a map essentially of how accurately your camera is capturing and recording those those color standards essentially. If you start to do this quite often, and as I say, I do this all the time, and I've seen them with countless different types of cameras as well, different brands, different models, you start to build up a picture of the weaknesses, the strengths and weaknesses of different cameras. And one thing that I've noticed immediately, and the first thing I did when I first started testing the C200, for example, is just how close these fall into these boxes. This isn't uncorrected. This is straight out of the camera. This is once I've made corrections in DaVinci Resolve so that these fall exactly where they should do. But this is actually unadulterated from the camera. The fact that these are either in or very close to the boxes where they should be, it shows how good this color size is. It'd be like it's a very visceral kind of it's actually got some substance to it, this idea of the Canon color science. You can actually visualize that, and it might be meaningless on its own, but trust me, if you do this and compare it to other cameras and how they plot these colors, you'll be amazed at how far some of these off, and they're particularly green. Again, I'm not going to name any names, but there are cameras that a lot of people are working with that I see all the time when we're grading, who plot green well over here, who plot blue well over here, who plot magenta well over here. You'll often find that red and yellow are pretty close. Most camera manufacturers prioritize the color accuracy of these colors because, of course, this is where flesh tones are. This is the skin tone line here. And so if these are out, then basically all skin's going to look wrong, and you would quite quickly end up with a riot on your hands. So you'll find that these are often very, very good in most cameras, but it's often the case that greens and magentas are really bad. There's a camera that is used an awful lot out there that we get fed an awful lot from our clients for Just Grade It. And cyan is over here and green is over here, and it takes a lot of work to get it back to where it should be. This is actually very little work comparatively, and as the cameras get better and better, they get more and more faithful. The other thing to recognize here is not just how close they are, but also just how straight those lines are. They're very, very consistent as you traverse from the saturated area to the lower saturation. We actually have some low saturation references here. And if they are straight as they move through, and there's not a kind of a curve to it, it shows you that the camera is very good at maintaining color accuracy through both high and low saturated parts of the frame, so shadows and highlights, low and high saturated parts of the frame. So a strong linear representation of those hues is really important. There are, again, cameras that I work with, that we work with in post, where you see a curve, and actually they can't maintain the accuracy of that particular hue in the shadows particularly, and they start to drift off. And those cameras, if you want to work with them accurately in color critical applications, you actually need to do some low luminance qualifiers in DaVinci Resolve to actually correct out the shadow accuracy of the hues so that they match up with the more saturated parts of the image, which is just extra work. It's fixable, but it's just extra work. You're pushing that data signal even further than you might want to. So these are different ways that we can kind of test, if you like, when we're talking about color science, a slightly disposable term that we hear all the time. This actually allows us to really visualize that and see just how good something is, particularly if you start to do that based on the different codecs. So I've actually done those references there. I did those for MP4 and RAW. The various different codecs you can shoot with, you can start to see the strengths and weaknesses and what might be a reason for shooting one codec over another. When it comes to RAW, let's come back into here. When it comes to, sorry, let's come back to these images here. when it comes to RAW, we will choose that for, as I said right at the beginning, for our commercial work, because it gives us a huge amount of scope for working with colours in the image. This project in particular, where colour accuracy was absolutely paramount, it was incredibly important that we had accurate skin tones, and there was a huge amount of effort that went into the RGB references, the choice of wardrobe, and the color palette that was established for these scenes. And so choosing a camera that obviously inherently recognizes and plays nicely with colors around it without extra effort and fiddling around is obviously a huge part of this. But then also choosing a codec that can support the changes to gamma and the work that you might need to do on that image is particularly important as well. And for me, a big ace up the sleeve of both the C200 and the C500 as well, and the C700 is the raw recording, the internal raw recording. It's quite incredible, actually, the quality of the image that can be captured internally. And I know it seems like a trivial thing, but having worked with camera systems having to rely on external devices to capture raw or very high quality recordings for us to take into post, versus these cameras that Canon make where you can record this signal internally, it makes a huge difference to workflow, to everything from just picking up the camera and shooting to everything else. It's a hugely important aspect of what leads us to using these cameras on some of these more commercial projects. And also, if I come back into these ones, these actually weren't shot raw. This image on the right is actually a still from the EOS R. The image on the left there is a frame grab from the C200, recorded MP4. So this whole project was recorded MP4. It was an Instagram social media project, and so we didn't need the extra latitude. A lot of these colors have been captured faithfully in camera by obeying relatively straightforward and common sense color pipeline rules, manually white balancing, and very little grading that's gone into these, and using the MP4 to work those images up. If I come back to here, this isn't unfortunately the unadulterated image, but in fact I think I've got the unadulterated image. Let me see if I can find it. I think shouldn't be too big because it's only the 2K. I won't download the 6K. This is actually from the C500. So yeah, this image here might be difficult coming over the stream here, but there is so much data in this image. This is the graded image. This was shot with the C500 Mark II. I shot this back in December, and the amount of detail in this is just mind-blowing. The raw recordings that were captured internally onto the CF Express card, yeah, absolutely crazy how much detail is here. There's even detail here on the left-hand side. There's even detail in this bush, which the sun is still below the tree line. So it's just starting to come above the horizon, which is actually behind these trees down here. So the sun's not even close to even being above the trees in the distance here. Therefore, no sunlight whatsoever is falling on this part of these trees. And even if it was, I'm on the north side of them. Sorry, the west side of them. So they are completely in shadow. The sun, even if it was up, would be on the opposite side. I couldn't see anything with my eyes at all in this area. And there's actually texture and there's detail here. And then the leaves along here that I couldn't actually see when I was there. In fact, a funny story, I was editing this, when I was editing this, I was looking through the graded images once I'd worked them up, and there's a little robin that flies in and just wanders around down here in the leaves. And I had no idea he was there when I was filming at all, but it actually became clear in the recorded signal. So there's a huge amount of data that can be acquired with these raw signals. And what's fascinating about it is that Canon have created these raw light files that not only are able to retain so much detail, but they are light enough that you can just skim through them and play through them on the timeline very, very comfortably. There's very little lag So they're a lightweight format that sort of belies almost how much data is within them. So it's a very compelling combination of both data-rich signal, but also lightweight enough to edit with on the fly with very little overhead in terms of the system. I actually find that we've got a Mac Pro here. I find that that struggles more with heavily temporally compressed codecs like those from the kind of drones and GoPros where they're using long GOP structures and temporally compressed files. Those are always harder to actually deal with than the cinema raw light files, which are huge in comparison, obviously, and massive amounts of data. So yeah, it's an interesting situation we find ourselves in with these cameras that are able to capture these details very faithfully and give us huge amounts of latitude. And really, from a colouring point of view, you couldn't really ask for much more, quite frankly. So let's go look at some questions. If any of you have actually made it through, let's see if we've got any questions in here. So,
yeah, I think there's a couple, Ollie.
Okay, cool. Let me try and not kick.
So if you scroll up, and then on the left-hand side, when you see that little hashtag there, so yeah, you see them on the right here.
This one? Am I already in the right place?
Yeah, you're already in the right place.
Lovely. Oh, you can't see the mouse. Sorry. What's the difference between native ISO versus the base ISO? Only use base ISO when wanting to shift more detail in shots. So, yeah, I mean, that's basically it. So the difference is that at your base ISO, you have no gain going through the sensor. So there's no additional gain going through on top of what's already working through the sensor. Whereas if you like native, where you're getting the maximum dynamic range, that is an engineering decision that's been made when Canon were developing this sensor. As to where you can get the best combination of dynamic range versus image detail. So what's the important point there is that we can alter it based on the dynamic range of our scene to get the kind of the best image from it. So I guess it's the common thread that ties everything I've just talked about together is this idea of thinking a bit more keenly and understanding what exactly the changes that you're making to your image, what they result in. And so in terms of ISO, rather than using that as an exposure tool, we're thinking about using that as a mechanism for handling our dynamic range versus image detail. So yeah, so if I've got a low dynamic range scene, actually sticking it in ISO 200, although I sacrifice some of my overall dynamic range, what dynamic range there is actually lowered, and you end up resolving a bit more detail in the shadows. A useful trick, a useful idea. Regarding exposing to the right, how do you know when to overexpose then or not overexpose if you have light areas like faces, even exposed? Only photography. Exposed to the right is. So I think I mentioned it. When I'm shooting raw, then I very much adhere to expose to the right, and I want to saturate the sensor and get as much good photons hitting that sensor as possible. But I'm doing that in non-destructive ways. So I'm either opening up the iris, I'm either altering the shutter speed, or I'm obviously ideally introducing more light into my scene. Those are all non-destructive ways that I'm going to be able to saturate the sensor with the good, rich imaging data, and then I can make changes to that data afterwards. So in terms of exposed to the right, I think with RAW with these cameras, that's absolutely applicable. There's nothing to stop you exposing to the right when you're in MP4. As to your question of when should you, when shouldn't you, I will. And this is one of the bigger kind of threads here, I suppose, is getting away from the idea that there's a one size fits all. So I wouldn't, there's no arbitrary kind of, oh, when this happens, do this. It's more about thinking about your subject and always prioritizing context. So if there are faces there, then I would try very hard not to have to expose to the right. Or if I do, only minimally, and maybe only a third or a half of the stop at the most. The idea of arbitrarily shooting in log all the time and overexposing by a stop and a half or 2 stops is, to me, ludicrous, absolutely ludicrous, particularly when you've got faces involved. And yes, if you've got a manufacturer saying that you should do that, you have to understand why they're saying that you should do that, and not just think that that's how all images are recorded or should be recorded. Exposed to the right has been around for donkey's years, and it's a very effective way of managing low dynamic range images and cleaning up image detail in areas where you need it, particularly around those sort of lower gamma, sort of lower mid-range areas. But understanding its uses and when it's doing you good, and when it's absolutely kind of going to be causing huge problems for you later on is the key thing there. How best to view log? Should you use a Rec. 709 monitor to view when shooting log? That's a really good question. It's very much dependent on you, really. I know a lot of people will use log to 709 LUTs in their monitor, so they can monitor Rec. 709. I'm just so used, as a first and foremost as a colorist, I'm so used to looking at waveforms with a log image and knowing exactly where I am, that actually I never use monitoring LUTs. I always view the log image from the sensor unadulterated, but I just am an absolute slave to my waveform. That's kind of God when I'm exposing, and I'm using references. I use these charts all the time. So handy having a 90% reflectance reference, if nothing else. And I'm recording these charts. They come with us into post, and they make the whole, they demystify and make the whole process incredibly reassuring, to the point where, as I say, I don't personally use Rec. 709 LUTs on my monitor, but I'm probably not a good one to kind of base that on, because I'm not shooting all the time by any stretch of the imagination. I know my way around a camera, but I'm not a jobbing cam op for hire with clients peering over his shoulder. So take what I say there with a pinch of salt. What gamma is best to use when a scene is not controlled? Document. Again, it's that question implies that there is a one size fits all, but no one ever accepts that as an answer. So I'm going to have to go with documentary style, uncontrolled. I really think wide DRs are very useful gamma in those types of situations, because, as I said, it's giving you a nice image that you don't really need to grade very much, if at all. Middle grey, so sort of faces and down, are nice and rich and contrasty and sort of Rec. 709, and then it does a nice roll off up in those highlights and controls some of those extreme highlights that you might get otherwise, and it basically gives you a bit more latitude when extra bright objects and subjects come into your scene. The truth is, though, that there is no one size fits all, and ideally you would control each different part of that. But yes, of course, in documentary and run and gun, then it's difficult to get away with that. I know you could then extend that to say, well, why not shoot all run and gun and documentary work log? I think that's fine. It comes down to a combination of strength of codec, quality of the camera. So, you wouldn't find me even referencing any of this if we were all shooting on, C500, C700s or equivalent, RAW capable, very high quality cameras. We wouldn't even have to have this conversation. The problem actually, and the reason why I even talk about it, is because there are a huge number of people who are shooting on mirrorless cameras and lower end cinema style cameras that are that just don't give you that level of image quality that some people are led to believe is some kind of magic bullet when you turn on log mode, that suddenly everything looks great. If I think one of the, again, purely speaking from a colorist's point of view, one of the most disheartening things I get is when people say, here's something we've shot it on an FS7 and it was low light, and don't worry, we've shot everything log. And it's like they've done you a huge favor. It's not a huge favor. It's that camera really needs a lot of light, and putting it into log is not going to solve a lot of issues. It's going to create more problems than it solves. So yeah, it's not an easy answer, I'm afraid. Bless you, Dale. I'm pleased that time flew. how do you find grading C-Log MP4s? I love it. It's great. I've had a lot of problems with the image breaking up once you start pushing it around. I'm guessing it's better to keep MP4s in wide damage. I think a key thing when shooting MP4s, and just to reiterate, Ollie, I brought up those images earlier of the stuff we shot for Byron. That was all shot C-Log. In fact, some of that stuff in the summer was shot C-Log 3 MP4. And the crucial thing, and this is where I think it's quite helpful, the fact that I'm first and foremost a colorist, is this idea of a fantastically accurate base, perfectly exposed, perfectly white balanced image. The more technical and disciplined that you can be in terms of in-camera exposure and white balance, the less you'll have to do with it. So problems with it breaking up are problems that will be far more likely if you are already starting from somewhere that's far away from where you should be. I showed you those charts with the MP4 with the C200. They're very, very close from a properly exposed, properly white balanced starting point. If you're having to push those so far to get them accurate, then it suggests that you've already started from the wrong place. So, you know, I cannot emphasize the importance of disciplined, manual white balance with a proper white balance card, and proper exposure, understanding where 90% reflectance should be for different gamma curves. As soon as you start doing that, I promise you, you will not have any breaking up of your MP4s in C-Log. They will look lovely jubbly. Diego, thanks for the seminar. 2 questions. I've got the C200 and a couple of new ones. When color matching these, would you reckon the classic color matches on the C200 at the moment? Sure. Any recommendations of using extract color checker on set or any other alternatives? As for your first question there, Diego, yes, it is a bit tricky. The Canon C100, even the Mark II, doesn't have this neutral color matrix in it. That's a more recent development. So kind of from now or from a couple of years ago onwards, the neutral color matrix is there to kind of save our skin in terms of matching. But obviously, if you've got a camera, one of the Canon cameras that doesn't have that, I also get this quite often, this question with people who've got 5D Mark IVs. It's only on the newer, like as in very new DSLR and mirrorless ranges, this neutral color matrix. In fact, I think I'm right in saying that the 1DX Mark III, is that the one that I'm not hugely up with the stills ones, but I'm pretty certain that's the newest DSLR that Canon have introduced. I think that's the first DSLR that they've introduced that actually got the neutral color matrix in it. Without that color matrix, then you are better off sticking the C200 in the EOS standard or video mode, which I believe both of which are available as options in the C100. And that will then match those color matrix. But again, the crucial thing that will really help in terms of matching cameras is using a chart, properly white balancing both the cameras, and then taking that chart, recording a few seconds and taking it with you into post. Because you've then got all of the references that you need, and you can clearly see on a vector scope and on a waveform monitor how the different cameras are plotting their luminance and chrominance and lining them up. And this works even in extreme examples. You'll be fine with a C100, C200. I recorded a training series a little while ago called Mastering Color. And due to unforeseen circumstances, we ended up recording for 3 days a multicam piece to camera with FS7, FS5, and C200, which is hardly an ideal mixture of cameras. And there was 9 hours of deliverable. And I had to color grade all of it to match. And the only reason that I got through it and that it worked at all was because we were using the charts and recording them periodically, beginning of each new section, sticking the chart up, capturing that from all the cameras. So it really makes a huge difference. As for your recommendations in terms of using extract color checker on set, that's a whole huge topic of conversation right there. There are alternatives to the extract color checker. Absolutely, there are other people who make charts. If you can't, I mean, there's different aspects of it. The reason I like the color checker video is because it introduces nice big luminance chips, which make it very easy to expose. The skin tone references are unique and really useful for checking skin tones. And I just the saturated and desaturated chromaticity references on there are invaluable for plotting and adjusting, and the fact that they are tuned to Rec 7 and 9. different charts do different things, and I know, for example, people who've got the Color Checker Classic, or one of the other sort of more photography-based checkers. Just the fact that you have a stable reference that's consistent, that will look exactly the same in real life, and therefore any differences you see from the cameras, are down to the camera differences. Anything like that's going to be useful. A proper white balance card. So again, there are other people that make them. Lastalite make them. There are various different ones out there. The thing about, we're not talking about hugely expensive objects here. They're not hideously expensive. And I kind of think, well, X-Rite, who, let's not forget, own Pantone and Munsell, who are the two biggest names in color science and color reproducibility and print colors that there is, that they're literally the gold standard. I kind of feel like, that we may as well stick with, for the differences in price and availability, I think we're probably better off sticking with those. But I'm an X-Rite ambassador, so I would say that. Ollie, are you externally recording your MP4 files? No, I don't externally record very infrequently these days. I often shoot handheld, Ollie, and I just don't like the extra bulk of an external recorder. So I very, very infrequently record externally. The EOS R, occasionally I'll use our external recorder to capture that at 10-bit if it's a particularly challenging scene. Like there was something that we shot recently that was a sunset that we were recording on an EOS R, so we used our Ninja V to capture that and make sure that was in 10-bit. But as I said earlier to your question, if you're capturing, particularly with the C200, which is 14-bit internally processed right up to the last minute when it captures and encodes that MP4, as long as you're white balancing properly and exposing properly, you should have very few problems. By all means, I'm not going to say don't bother. It's just for me personally, I don't like the extra bulk of the recorders on top. In fact, I prefer to use really lightweight. We've also got the Shinobi, which is a lightweight one, but the Small HD Focus is another great one, that are non-recording but very light monitors. They're great for monitoring. But if I have the opportunity, or if I wanted to, or if we're in a studio environment and you can't afford the overheads of RAW, but you want a good sort of better, more robust codec for grading, then by all means, record into 10-bit. It's just that for me personally, I quite often don't, but that's just me. Very much from the base notes comes from using the EX1 for a long time, and to mean 0 dB is king. Yeah. Adding in gain was a big no. Yeah. Add gain and purposes now for a native OS is alien to me. Okay. My other question was being new to log and grading. Why does log make some scenes less sharp? Is this only the shadows, etc.? Along with noise. Yeah. Why does? Okay. I'm going to try and do these questions one at a time. Base sensitive, yes, I can understand coming from an EX1. We're talking about a couple of decades of sensor development here. Always think about gain and sensitivity the same way you would with microphones. It's about the quality of the signal. It's about the quality of the management of that amplification of the signal. So yes, you're absolutely right. 0 dB is kind of king in a purely image quality point of view, but once you start factoring in wide dynamic range scenes and increased dynamic range, it does make sense that there is an area where increasing that going up from that base sensitivity actually allows you to have a signal that can capture that wider dynamic range. I mean, that's just part of the way that it works. All cameras will have a native ISO that is optimized for increased dynamic range. That's kind of a given with the way they're working. We're moving towards, there's more and more camera manufacturers that are working with dual native ISOs. There are all kinds of clever things that are going on with sensor technology, but it's just the reason why it seems alien to you coming from an EX1 is just those cameras back then were just so much less effective at managing and cleaning up that increased signal gain. Being new to grading, why does log make some see? Sharpness, we perceive sharpness based on edge contrast, and when you record log, you're obviously decreasing contrast, so you perceive it as less sharp, even though it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be less sharp at all. So that's all it is. It's just a function of our vision. I remember the day I got glasses. I happened to be looking at a piece of paper in the opticians that had some black writing on it. And as I put the glasses on, it looked as if the black writing on the white paper increased in contrast. So it works both ways. As things get sharper, they appear more contrasty. As things get more contrasty, they appear sharper. It's just it's the way that our vision works. It's that differences between bright and dark and edge contrast. That's all it is. Is this is log only for shadows, etc.? Is this only for shadows along with the noise and dark areas? Not 100% on what you mean there. Why does applying a Rec 79 LUT not make log footage the same as shooting Rec 79 post? No, that's not a ridiculous question. Applying a Rec 709 LUT, if you've got the camera manufacturer's technical LUT, then that should do a Gamut and Gamma conversion from the source footage. But you do need to make sure that it's a LUT that knows what's coming in and going out. There are so many different LUTs out there. Some of them are quite generic, some of them are specific. So you should find, if you get the camera manufacturer's proper Rec 709 LUT and set it up to use the one that's coming from the correct source Gamut and Gamma, it should look the same as shooting 709 in the camera. But yeah, it might be that you're using the wrong one. Diego, you're welcome. Jake, any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I can see a couple of people typing, but basically once we're done with the text, I'll start unmuting people. See if people want to have any questions that aren't seen in the chat. God. Hour and 55 minutes. It's gone quick, mate. It has.
Yeah, it's how I get my kids to sleep. Well, I did a 3-hour one this morning. That's 5 hours of constant talking now. My throat's starting to go.
I was about to say your throat's going to be absolutely shot tomorrow.
I've been well warmed up from talking solidly for 3 days doing my new MZ course. So can everyone hear us talking? Like, should I still not be swearing? Oh.
Keep it PC. Keep it PC. I'm shooting very bright scene on the C200. Then should I actually use a higher ISO if the dynamic range up into the highlights? Another question.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Ollie. And that's actually something I meant to mention. I've so focused on going the other side. No, you're absolutely right. But bear in mind that 800 and above is going to be fixed. You're going to have the same number of stops above middle grey, whether you're at 800 or 1600 or anything above that point. So it doesn't follow that you keep going up. It keeps shifting the dynamic range sensitivity up. But yes, if you are, I mean, as a general rule of thumb, I kind of keep the camera at 200, and then based on my scene's dynamic range, decide where I should go up from there. If you've got a bright scene, well, see, even a bright scene, that doesn't necessarily denote whether or not it's high dynamic range, but I'm going to assume that you mean it's bright and there's also areas of darkness, so it's a high dynamic range scene. Then yes, you should. And it feels wrong. It's like, oh, I've got a bright high dynamic range scene. I'll use my ISO to kind of manage that. But for the exact opposite reasons of what I said earlier, what you should be doing is using ND and keeping your ISO at 800, because that will actually that will control the detail in those highlights particularly better than controlling that exposure with your ISO. So I guess it comes down to the same point. You shouldn't be controlling exposure using ISO. Your exposure should really, ideally, always be controlled via iris, shutter speed, and light, whether that's cutting light with NDs or adding in light with artificial light sources or bouncing natural light sources. That will always give you the best quality image. We started with 26 people, didn't we, Jake? How many people?
I think it went up to about 32 at one point. Obviously, I think that was a couple of CVP staff members jumping in as well. But there was 26 people signed up, and there's still 24 people watching, and there's how many in the chat.
My God, you've all got staying power. Well done. Thank you so much. You're very welcome. Really appreciate that. That last point, I found it difficult to find an actual conversion LUT from log. So this was the Sony. Yeah, just always go to the camera manufacturer's website, get their proper LUTs. if you're also able to give an explanation, that would be great, even though it was on a Sony. So shooting Rec 79 was horrible for highlights. Yeah, it would be. It gave a kind of green cast and overexposed highlight. Was this what you were talking about earlier with mirrorless cameras not being great, etc.? I mean, Rec 79 is a gamma curve designed for 10 stops. If you are pointing your camera at any scene that's above 10 stops of dynamic range, you either need to be introducing light or cutting light to manage your scene's dynamic range. So the scene I was pointing at was more than 10 stops of dynamic range, as evidenced by the fact that when I was in Rec 79, I had to choose whether I had my the outside exposed or the inside exposed. I couldn't have both. As a side note, any of you that have ever studied Ansel Adams, he came up with the zone system for breaking a scene up into 10 zones of exposure. And it's a photographic thing, and it's really useful to study that, because it helps you get into the mindset of context, and thinking about your scene and starting to divide up what you're looking at into areas of luminance and managing that. So in my case, I had choices to make, either expose outside or expose inside, or expose for outside and then introduce more artificial light inside to essentially bring up my floor and minimize my dynamic range by increasing my bed, my floor of the image. By adding more light onto that, I'm bringing it up in exposure closer towards the highlights outside, and essentially I end up minimizing my scene's dynamic range. So with a situation like you had with your A6000, Rec 79, no, it wouldn't have been enough unless you would have been able to manage the differences between your subject and the ambient light. And if you can't do that, then yes, it makes it very difficult. The green tint, I don't know what that is. That sounds like maybe it depends what lens you had on. You maybe we're getting some kind of aberration introduced through the lens. I'm not familiar enough with the sensor in the A6000 to know whether or not that might have been a manifestation of its color matrix potentially, but wasn't sure about that. When I talk about with mirrorless cameras, they're smaller cameras. They aren't necessarily designed for this, or they take a lot of extra engineering to get them to even manage these log curves. Generally speaking, it's very hard to manage heat as well. And I know Sony, certainly in the early days with their mirrorless cameras, struggled with heat. And although this is completely my own interpretation and not based on any evidence whatsoever, I'm sure that a lot of the heat management issues that come with mirrorless cameras are one of the reasons why Sony were in a situation where they were having to advise people to overexpose those cameras to manage the noise that was in the shadows. So yeah, very tricky. Ended up shooting everything log, yes, even dark areas, and I bet you were struggling with those dark shots that were in log. Had to go to end your explanation. That's what was wrong. Yeah, honestly, SJTO4. I'd love to know your actual name. Sorry, but don't feel bad about it. Everybody, so many people I speak to struggle with this idea, and it doesn't help because there's this sort of there's Chinese whispers. Like, oh, shoot log. Everyone should shoot log. And even people I know who should know better, I've heard them say things like, shooting log makes it easier to grade, or shooting log optimizes it for color grading. It's complete and utter nonsense. It's correct in certain circumstances with certain cameras, with certain codecs, but to arbitrarily say that shooting log for everything is going to give your colorist a lovely job and an easy job is just not true. I mean, as we've identified, if you're shooting log in a scene that's dark and got a low dynamic range, you're not helping yourself at all. At best, you might have a very good quality camera and good quality codec, and that scene would look nice and clean and could be pulled back. But if you're talking about cameras like mirrorless cameras and stuff like that, then actually you end up in this awful situation where the image just falls to pieces, and it's very, very difficult to recover it. So I often say the A7S II is one of the most dangerous cameras out there. It's, you know, it's fine. You can get, I've seen some lovely stuff shot on it, but I've also seen tons and tons and tons of stuff where people have stuck it in S-Log3 and, you know, recording absolutely everything, both high dynamic and low dynamic range stuff in it. And, you know, you either end up with it being incredibly noisy or soft or falling to pieces because there's not enough data to recover it and put it back where it should be, or you overexpose it so much that you end up pushing key subjects into the more compressed part of the gamma curve, and you end up with this horrible plasticky kind of look. And you know, I'm not picking on Sony in any way as a brand. It's literally just those particular cameras do have those. They do exhibit those problems. And you know, I did shoot with. We owned a A7R II for a number of years, which we ended up replacing with EOS R. And, you know, we used to have terrible problems with that. The colors all over the place, very tricky to get it to look just right. And, you know, so you're certainly not alone. Don't panic about that. It's the most common thing I get asked after I've done workshops is normally from Sony users is, I'm doing everything right. I'm shooting everything in S-Log3 with my A7S II. How come it doesn't look right? And that's why. Yes, there is another alternative. We're talking about two extremes here, Rec 709 and log. Of course, there's hypergammas on that Sony you're talking about. There's WideDR with the Canon systems. Those are sort of intermediary, sort of Rec 709 based or inspired gamma curves that require little color grading and do a nice job with a sort of a wider range of medium dynamic range shots. But as I said before, the thing that ties all of this together is about choosing a camera system that faithfully captures your scene, that's not, you know, that you don't have to remember to kind of wrongly expose it in order to correct it. But it's you know, it's about understanding that each scene is different, each context is different. Yes, YDR does only affect areas above middle grey. Maybe I didn't read your question properly. So is there another alternative shooting on that kind of camera apart from anything that's right? Shooting dark areas. The thing to do is, if you're shooting something that's dark, the thing to do is to, as with everything I've said, is if you can't resolve detail in those dark areas through opening up the iris, or if it's not moving and the camera's not moving, slowing the shutter down, which is fairly unlikely, you're never going to be able to get a good image in those dark areas by relying on anything else in camera. You can only get a good image by introducing light. So introducing light through artificial light or bouncing natural light. It's, you know, there's a reason why every single feature film and TV show that you've ever seen behind the scenes on, and any other big commercial you've ever seen BTS on, they have tons of lights. You know, I did once get asked by someone, or you know, I think they were talking about a Sony mirrorless camera, like, oh, this log's great. It means I don't have to take lights out with me. And you know, this is a really dangerous approach to working with cameras. If anything, it's more important. You want to very carefully introduce light into those areas, because you can always pull that down. You can always grade those back down. But if you don't have the detail in camera in the first place, you can't bring them up.
Cool. I think that's all the written questions.
Last question there, I would say if it's a Canon, I'd say YDR, because the middle grey and down is same as Rec 709. And then the uncontrolled light, if you suddenly get some sort of bright highlight suddenly appearing, then the YDR will control that better than Rec 709 will. You know, recce, plan in advance, think about the time of day you're going to be shooting, where the light's coming from, plan for cloudy, plan for, you know, this is what all this pre-production's for, to try and make these camera decisions as far in advance as you possibly can, and then really understanding what's going on with your camera, doing tests when you have the opportunity to, knowing how it responds to being overexposed, underexposed, pulling it back, what the benefits and negatives are. Once you have all of that and your sort of built-in muscle memory, it means that when you're in those flexible, uncontrolled docu-style setups, you make better decisions. Great. Thank you, Simon.
Hi, Ollie. Thank you for everything until now. So I'm going to shoot this short movie in a C100 Mark II. The particularity of this project is that in post-production will be turned into black and white. Any advice to apply on set in the camera so I can get the best result when turning it into monochrome when we get the color correction phase?
Yes, very good question. So obviously contrast is going to be of the utmost importance. I mean, it always is anyway, but it's particularly important with what you're doing. What you want to do is you want to plan. Actually, it's not so much anything to do with the camera, but what you want to plan to do is really manage your wardrobe and set design quite carefully, Deborah. So when you're working in monochrome, you then adjust the intensity of the color channels themselves. So for example, if you want to brighten up faces, then you would increase the amount of red in the red channel of the gamma, and you will see that objects that have a lot of red in them, so skin, will get brighter. So if you want, it stands to reason then if you wanted a nice amount of contrast in, say, a character, if you have them in a red dress or an orange jumper or something like that, then that's automatically going to make it tricky for you to get that contrast between their clothes and their faces. Whereas if they're wearing blue, it'll be easy for you to then control the amount of intensity of the red channel and therefore the brightness of faces versus the brightness of the clothes. So you'll end up actually, if you do it right, you'll end up shooting something that's kind of interesting in color because it will look sort of slightly weird, but stick to wardrobe and set decoration and locations that have nice clean greens, blues and reds, because it will be those color channels that you'll be manipulating in monochrome to introduce contrast and brightness and dark areas. So it's, if you make sure that those things don't overlap too much, then it will make it easier for you to grade it. Blair, yeah, good question. Yes, the image gets brighter when you increase the ISO, but bear in mind that the ISO is something that is done post signal. So the sensor captures the photons of light that hit the sensor, and then there's an analog to digital conversion. Now, some cameras, depends on the camera you're using, some cameras actually apply some gain at that analog digital conversion stage. But let's assume that that hasn't happened. You've got the conversion from the analog, literally the raw charge information from the sensor, and that electrical information is then gained up or down. Because of the way that the digital imaging systems work with these sensors, is as you increase that gain, and this changes from manufacturer to manufacturer. It depends on how the camera's been engineered, and they're all slightly different. There's a secret sauce for each different manufacturer and their particular sensor, and there's various things that they have to take into account internally. But there will be a sweet spot where a certain amount of gain, yes, it brightens the image, but it also opens up certain parts of the dynamic range to be captured effectively based on the recording system. So the ins and outs of that, I will fully admit, I don't go quite all the way down that rabbit hole, and that's where it's very useful to have someone who's more of an engineer to chip in. But there is a point where a certain amount of gain is necessary to reach the optimum dynamic range that sensor is capable of. And it's all about how it's engineered, how many stops above and below middle grey they've engineered that sensor to respond to. Ed, you're welcome. James, you're welcome. Deborah, you're very welcome. I hope that answers all of your questions, everybody. You're going to wrap it up there, do you think, Jake? Or
Yeah, yeah. If nobody else has got any other questions, like I said, if you want to unmute yourselves, ask us, feel free to. And if you don't, then obviously just put it in the chat. But yeah, otherwise, I'll be on the Discord for afterwards. If anyone has any other questions, just let me know. Cool. Thank you, Ollie. That was awesome, mate.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks, Ollie.
Oh, you're very welcome.